Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Darkness. Gather round and try to stay in the light. Some of the others from the dark aren't quite as civil as I am, and I'd hate to have to clean up that mess. Skinwalkers, from Crimson Soldier. I recently heard a story while listening to YouTube, and it was eerily similar to an experience I had when I was younger, so I thought I'd share. When I was around 13, my cousin, who was 12, and I decided we were going to camp in our yard. We have a shared property that has been passed down through the family for generations. There's around 150 yards or so between our houses, and it's just an open area of yard that hits our fields. The total land is around 2.5 square miles, so it's pretty big. We have fields, a creek, and even our own bit of forest. Anyway, we decided it was a nice summer night, and we were going to camp out, so I grabbed the tent we had in my parents' garage, and we spent the evening setting it up and then going to his house for dinner. At around 9 p.m., we decided to go to sleep, since it was getting pretty dark out, and there really wasn't much we could do outside while in the tent except talking about our plans for summer. At around 11 p.m. or so, I got a call from my then-girlfriend, and she was pretty upset about something that had happened earlier in the day. I was pretty tired, so it took me a while to actually understand what she was saying and calm her down, but once I did, we continued to chat for a bit until my cousin grabbed my shoulder hard. I told him I was on the phone and he could wait, but he just pulled me around, and when I saw his face, I instantly told my girlfriend I had to go. He had his finger up to his mouth in the shushing motion, and he looked absolutely terrified. He told me to look towards the entrance of the tent in a whisper before I could even ask him what was wrong. When I looked, I didn't see anything at all, so I just told him to go back to sleep. But after that, I heard the sound of someone walking around the tent. It seemed very unlikely that anyone would be out here unless it was my dad, and he wasn't the type of person to prank anyone. We are generally pretty safe on our property, as we are about 10 miles out of town, and everyone that lives near us are family or old family friends. I told my cousin to be quiet and stay down, and I was going to see if I could find out who it was. But when I peeked out the front of the tent, I didn't see anything. I assumed whoever it was just ran off, or maybe it was my dad after all. But instead of pranking us, he had just decided to come check on us. I was proven wrong, however, as I heard the footsteps walking around the tent again as soon as I laid down. It felt like hours I listened to the footsteps. Sometimes they would change pace and rhythm, but after a while I heard them stop. I ended up looking at the entrance to the tent as I had the feeling of being watched, and I finally saw what had freaked my cousin out so much. Standing there, peering into the tent, was what appeared to be a thin man who was very dirty and almost completely naked except for some animal skins that he wore. His eyes seemed to shine, like an animal's eyes would if you shined a light on them, only there was nothing that should have made them glow like that. I laid there frozen as we peered into each other's eyes for what seemed like a lifetime, but was probably only around 5 minutes or so. At this point, he very calmly and slowly backed away, turned around, and then ran off in the direction of our forest. I stayed awake, straining my ears for any sound indicating that he was coming back, but after about an hour and a half, I had exhausted myself and fell asleep. When we woke up, we immediately looked around the tent to see if maybe we were just seeing things, but sure enough, there were bare footprints circling the tent. While looking at the prints, I noticed that some of the tracks were coyote prints, which would have accounted for the change in rhythm. We ended up finding a set of tracks that led into our field towards our forest, and noted that about halfway from the tent to the field, the prints started changing from the bare footprints of the man to the man on all fours with footprints and handprints, then slowly becoming smaller and turning into coyote prints. Ever since this experience, my cousin and I have both had multiple encounters with what we now believe is a skinwalker. I had never heard of one of these until a couple of months ago, when I first heard the Skinwalker story that inspired me to tell my story. The description of what they called a skinwalker is what prompted me to look it up, and why we now believe what we encountered was in fact a skinwalker. Night hikes, from Anonymous. The sun sets awfully early in my neck of the woods, but I still take my dog hiking in the national park after my shift. Sadly, it's around 9 or 10 p.m. at the earliest, usually until 11 or midnight. It's been a routine to carry a flashlight, my GPS, watch, water, bowl, and my firearm tucked away. It's beautiful to be truly alone and submersed in nature, so I leave behind my phone. No signal here anyway. Half an hour into my last hike, I'm chatting with my dog about my day. Then I heard a piano. It was faintly playing long, sweet notes towards me from each direction. Cookies instantly went rigid, her body stoic and strong. She does not do this even when there's a predator. She will take off running and ask questions later. Though there wasn't an origin to the sound, it was just thickening the air, if that makes sense. So she had nowhere to run. I chalked it up to the wind since it's fall and continued forward. 10 minutes in, I heard my voice calling to my dog from the west. It stopped us in our tracks. It sounded raspy, choppy, and curt, like someone had cut and edited my voice. "Cookies, get over here, baby girl," sounded like
"Cookies, get here, girl."
My dog looks at me with such confusion, and I tell her to stay beside me. The voice is much louder.
"Here, treats, cookies."
When I say it was louder, it was like the volume had been raised, but not the tone of my voice, which is what Cookie responds to. We started heading back, roughly 30 minutes left. I'm spooked and thinking of the mistakes I made to attract this hot mess. Using the same route, not having a phone on me, using a flashlight, talking instead of listening, not blessing the hike, wearing a neon yellow vest, not telling my girlfriend when to expect me back. Briskly walking back, the sound of my voice become more warped and bent, but closer. Cookies and me ended up running the rest of the way. I personally felt like if I looked back to see what was behind me, it would be the last thing I ever saw. My voice was blaring at this point, and filled with anger, booming from both the west and the east. I have never been more scared, nor have I ever run so fast. Cookies was whining and rushing me along, but also wouldn't look back at me. We broke free from the trail, and the voices ceased instantly. The sounds of nature returned in its place. I don't know what to think. My mom's experiences in the Napa Valley, from Jelly Belly. Disclaimer: these are my mom's stories, from when she was young to her early 50s. When my mom was young, she lived on the border between the towns of Calistoga and Napa, nestled on the base of a large hill. Her house, connected to the main highway by a long, winding driveway, was built directly on an old Native American campsite. We know this from local history, and from the many obsidian arrowheads we found scattered in the creek bed along the driveway and in the dirt in the backyard. The backyard had a pool, and then a small lawn which trailed off into the wild, dense hillside. My mom, who was a bit of a tomboy, loved to explore up in the hills with her two older brothers. She recalls one time while they were walking up the hills, and she was around 10 or 11, when they started hearing their mother's voice. But something was off about it. First of all, it was coming from deep in the woods, and secondly, it was oddly slow, and the words sounded forced, and most unnerving at all, it was calling for them each by name to come to the bear cave. This is what they called a small cave up in the hills, one far from where they were. She and her brothers immediately turned back. Thankfully, they weren't that far from her house, so they were able to get back safely. She tells me this happened, the voices calling to her that sounded like her mother or her father or her brothers, as well as hearing sounds that she described as a growl, like if a bear and a cow had a baby and it got mad. Now skip forward around 40 years. My mom has turned the place into an inn after my grandmother died. And the first signs that something weird was happening was when she found a dead buck in the backyard. Now, living in the hills, there were a lot of deer, and a couple of dead does and bucks weren't out of the ordinary. But the buck looked like it had been ripped apart. Flesh was scattered everywhere, in the pool, on the pool deck, in the grass. But what my mom thought was odd was the fact that only the heart and stomach was missing. Nothing else, just a torn-into abdomen and a missing heart and stomach. The last story I've heard happened a couple of months ago. She was outside with our Labrador, cleaning up around the pool. It was twilight and the sun was nearly set. She suddenly starts hearing the same bear cow cry up in the hills. It's getting louder and louder, and so is the lab's barking. Our lab, usually a sweetheart, is going ballistic. She's barking and growling as loud as she can, nearly drowning out the cries. My mom immediately takes her inside and locks the doors. The cries stopped after an hour, but she was thoroughly shaken. So far, these are the only stories she'll tell me about. She still doesn't let my brother and I up into the hills, though she claims that the noises and deer were only mountain lions and voices just her young imagination. I believe it was a Wendigo. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear more. If you would like to have your story narrated, you can send it to storiesofdarkness55@gmail.com. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And as always, pleasant dreams.